Hi everyone, in this lecture we will be covering Chapter 6, talking about observational methods. Technically, all research requires some level of observation, but this chapter specifically looks at research known as observational research. Before we jump into different types of observational research, we need to be able to distinguish from quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is research with quantifiable data, meaning that it uses numbers. With quantitative data, we can only measure things that can be counted. It usually has larger sample sizes than qualitative data, and the conclusions are usually based on statistical analyses. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is research conducted with non-numerical data. So this is looking at things like open-ended questions or opinions. It focuses on people's own descriptions and their own words. So typically we get more in-depth information from fewer individuals. But because we are not using numbers, our conclusions are usually based on interpretations of the data by the investigator. And there are some mixed method studies that use both methods. For instance, say you want to see what is the best product at a company right now. You could quantitatively see which product makes the most money, or you could qualitatively get consumers' opinions on what they like or don't like about a company's products. You could also do both and see if the products people like are indeed the ones making the most money. Going into some specific observational methods, first there's naturalistic observation, which is a descriptive method in which observations are made in a natural setting. This would be like watching how members of a sports team interact or watching how children naturally behave in a daycare setting. The goal here is to see what naturally occurs. You are not manipulating any variables, you are just observing. As you can imagine, if you bring someone into a lab, they might not behave how they usually do. Maybe they're on their best behavior in front of a stranger. With naturalistic observation, we are watching people essentially in their natural habitat. Gathering information in naturalistic studies depends on the setting and the variable of interest. Sometimes researchers will take notes or audio recordings, and sometimes even video recordings. It just depends on the study. This type of research is usually qualitative, but not always. Say you're interested in phone use and distracted behavior. You could look at this quantitatively and tally up how many times people on their phones run into things or don't acknowledge when someone's speaking to them. Or you could do this qualitatively and simply describe the instances you observed. And as I said, we are not manipulating anything or influencing the setting in any way. You are not, say, putting tripping hazards in front of people or shouting their name and seeing if they look over. You are just observing. However, know that just you being there can still change participants' behavior. If people know they are being observed, they might act differently. Because of this, sometimes naturalistic observation uses participant observation, where the observer takes an active role in the situation. They are an active participant in the study. By doing this, the researcher has a more in-depth opportunity to learn about the participants. Think about a teacher engaging in a new activity with their students. If they are participating in that activity, interacting with those students may lead to more in-depth information than just sitting back and observing them. However, the teacher may also lose objectivity when interacting with their students, which introduces bias into the study and may also affect natural behavior. Think about how children might behave if their teacher is engaging in the activity with them, as opposed to sitting back and just observing. So there are benefits and drawbacks to being an active or concealed observer. And this, of course, exists along a spectrum. On one end, someone might be observing in a crowded restaurant and people don't even know they're being observed or that a researcher is even there. And remember that this is okay if there is no expectation of privacy. On the other end, the participant may be participating in the study themselves. There are limits to naturalistic observation. First, we can't study all variables that we may be interested in. There is much less control using this method than there would with, say, an experiment. We don't tend to be testing hypotheses with this method, but rather just describing what we observe. Naturalistic observation can also be time-consuming and expensive. If you want to train a researcher to go out and observe, you have to spend a lot of time teaching them what to look for, and then they have to travel to that area and then observe, whether it be for an hour, a day, a week, or longer. If this is a paid position, that adds up. And procedures tend to not be well defined. If you don't know what is going to happen, you really don't know what to plan for. You may want to use naturalistic observation when you cannot manipulate a variable, especially due to ethical reasons. For example, if we wanted to examine how people react in, say, emergency situations, we can't put people in emergency situations. But we can maybe do a ride along with first responders and observe how both professionals and those experiencing the emergency react. You can also use this method if you are concerned about how behavior may change in a laboratory setting. For instance, if you want to study child social development, children might act differently in the lab than they would at school. We can also use this when situations are difficult to simulate realistically. Going back to the emergency example, even if we could ethically create a fake emergency situation, we might not get true responses of how people would respond if they know they are being part of a study. The last reason is for animal observation. If you're interested in animals and say their natural habitat, you can't remove them from their habitat and expect them to act the same. Moving into systematic observation, this method observes one or more specific variables, usually made in a precisely defined setting. This can be a natural environment, but it is more well-defined than naturalistic observation. Systematic observations tend to be quantifiable, so we are using numbers, and it can be used to test a hypothesis. As you know, hypotheses come before data collection, which means you know what you are going to observe and what you think you will find. To make observations quantifiable, you need a coding system, which is a set of rules used to categorize your observations. In my undergrad, I had the opportunity to observe preschool children's behavior in a teaching observation classroom. I was able to sit behind a two-way mirror and code children's playing behaviors with another researcher. Every 30 seconds, we would code the type of play children were using with a number. One for cooperative play, like playing pretend with other children. Two for parallel playing, where children are playing next to each other but not with each other. Three for solitary play, and so on. And we were hypothesizing that girls would engage in more cooperative play than boys. There are methodological issues with systematic observation. First is equipment. Some equipment can be costly if you're using things like audio-visual recording. Researchers can sometimes record data without this, but human memory and attention is less reliable. Then there's reactivity, which is the idea that the presence of the researcher will affect people's behavior. In my case, the children did not see me, but the teachers knew I was there, and that might change their behavior and therefore the behavior of the children. There are also issues with reliability. There was another researcher there with me, so we could do inter-rater reliability checks and make sure we were recording behaviors the same way. But who knows if these children engage in different play on different days? We may have just caught them on an off day, which leads into sampling. The longer you observe and the more days you observe, the more accurate the data would be. A case study is a descriptive account of the behavior, past history, and other relevant factors concerning a specific individual or small group of individuals. Case studies sometimes overlap with naturalistic observation, but not always. Case studies are an in-depth observation examining everything about a person, place, or experience. Usually, case studies are about individuals with a rare or unusual condition, often something that cannot be ethically induced in an experiment. Maybe someone or a small group of individuals have a unique brain injury, and we want to study them to know more about the condition and the extent to which people can heal from it. There is also psychobiography, which is a type of case study in which the life of an individual is analyzed using psychological theory. Typically, this is looking at historical figures such as John Lennon, Michael Jackson, Adolf Hitler, and so on, where we look at everything we know about their lives from a psychological standpoint. With case studies, we need to worry about observer bias, in which there are systematic errors in observation that result from an observer's expectations. So, the expectations we have about something as researchers may create expectancy effects, which are the impact of expectations on the outcome of the study. In other words, this is researcher bias. Using that brain injury example, you can imagine that if you don't expect this person to be able to heal and regain any abilities, you might just report on someone's failure to walk or speak and not report on the small gains in speech or motor abilities. Most of the time, this is just by accident, and the researcher doesn't even realize they're doing it. The case of Clever Hans is a great example of observer bias. The video is linked on the course page. It's a fun one and it's only a couple of minutes long, and it's there for you to watch, either pausing the video now and going over to it, or to watch at the end of the lecture. So, how can we reduce observer bias? First, we can use recording equipment. If we have evidence that something has been said, we don't need to rely only on memory. It also allows us to have inter-rater reliability and see if two people interpret the situation in the same way. We also need to be aware of the possibility of bias. Researchers tend to think about themselves as being objective people, but we are all human, and acknowledging that is important for being able to take steps to reduce it, such as using a double-blind method. This isn't always possible, especially in case studies, but if you're doing an experiment, it's helpful if the participant and the researcher are unaware of the participant's status of being in the experimental or control group. Say if you're testing a new drug, one drug might be the active medication and one might be the sugar pill, and neither the participant or researcher knows which one they took, so no expectations can be projected onto the situation. When we are examining behavior, we can't capture every little behavior someone engages in over the course of their life, right? We have to take a sample of that. The goal of sampling behavior is to obtain a representative sample of a behavior, and there are a few different methods for doing this. First is time sampling, where we choose various time intervals for observations. The example I gave when observing children was every 30 seconds, and we did this over the course of 2 full school days. This is best for observing frequently occurring events and behaviors. Children in a daycare setting are going to engage in a lot of play, which is constantly changing from moment to moment. Then there is event sampling, where you choose a specific event to record from beginning to end. This is best for things that are infrequent or unpredictable. If you were to examine an emergency situation, you could watch how things unfold from start to finish. And then you have situation sampling, where we are observing in as many conditions as possible. It's not just examining children over the course of a day, but an entire school year on different days of the week, and maybe around different holidays. With emergencies, it's not just observing a car crash, but multiple types of emergencies and the different behaviors they bring on. As you can imagine, this would increase external validity and allow us to generalize the findings more broadly. Lastly, there is archival research, where we use previously compiled information to answer research questions. This data is already collected, and the researcher is not collecting anything themselves. Maybe you are looking at traffic records or census data. A lot of the time, this information is publicly available, but it could also be from prior research studies as well. Some data might come from statistical records. Maybe someone is really interested in statistics from sports games and they examine that. Other data might come from survey archives. Many polling organizations make their data publicly available, and maybe you want to examine political opinions over time. And lastly, we have written and mass communication records. These are documents kept by historical societies. These are things like diaries and journals or speeches. And with this, we can do a content analysis, which is a systematic analysis of existing documents. This is essentially a systematic observation where you are using that coding scheme we talked about, but applied to historical documents. For this week's activity, you are going to do your own little systematic observation. We are just going to set it up so you don't need to come to any formal conclusions, but you are to choose 2 music videos from different artists of your choice. However, you do have to make sure that the video isn't just the lyrics or a scene that doesn't change. Believer from Imagine Dragons or Antihero from Taylor Swift are good examples of this, and you're welcome to use them. Link your video of choice in your submission so we can see what you picked, and select 3 variables that you can code in that video. This might be tempo, facial expressions, positive emotion, and so on. Choose 3 for one video and a different 3 for the other. Then create a research question and decide how you would code each variable in a systematic way. For example, if we were using tempo, you could score this on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 5 being the most upbeat and 1 being silence. But because this might change over the song, maybe you would code this every 10 or 15 seconds throughout the video. And then talk about what you could do to minimize observer bias in your study. And if you have any questions on this activity or the content itself, please let me know.